If you've been shopping at Harbor Freight over the last few years, you likely have seen one of these, or maybe you've even received a few as a free prize for your purchase. In fact, I have about half of a dozen of these sitting around the house, and only half of those even work because the batteries run out pretty quickly. The flashlight comes with this little cradle that has 3 AAAs inside of it. In this video, we're going to swap this out by taking 2 flashlights and combining them into one, and that way it will take 3 AA batteries. Before we get started, a note. Yes, I know I can just go buy a new flashlight, and in fact I invite you to do so. While you're at it, buy me a new flashlight. But that's not the point here. The point is I have a bunch of these, and the earlier model that has this array of LEDs in it, this one is actually pretty long lasting. Impressively so. I bet some of mine are probably a decade old. The only thing that goes bad is the batteries. Further, the little button press on the back side is also a pretty rugged piece of equipment. Other than that, all the device really has to it is an aluminum tube. And so there's not all that much to go wrong. Before we get started, here's another quick life hack for you. It's just a ceramic disc magnet and some hot glue. If you insist on keeping your flashlights short, then I at least recommend that you do that to it. First, let's talk about the parts. Once again, if you have this array, that's good. If you have this single LED, that's not so good. Our finished flashlight is going to consist of 2 halves. One half will just be a normal flashlight. This one has the array, and then the other one, we're going to pop the array out. And you can do this by putting a piece of metal rod or something down here and tapping it out with a hammer. This is what comes out. As I said, not much to break. A pretty basic circuit board with an LED array that could last forever if you don't get it wet. And it just goes into this reflector thing, and then it's covered up by a piece of acrylic glass. Now that we've taken the array out of one of them, that makes the second half of our flashlight. So the first half is the array with no backside. Second half is no array, but it has a button. Now let's join them together. To do that, we want a piece of 1/2 inch inside diameter PVC, Schedule 40 stuff. This works great for 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is that, and reason number 2 is this. We want to cut it to about 5 3/4. It doesn't have to be exactly that, but we want to shoot for around there, and I'll show you why in a little bit. Of the million or so ways that you can cut PVC, the best is still a miter saw. Just make sure that you hold it tight so that it doesn't spin while you're cutting it. And also make sure that the hole in your throat plate isn't bigger than the cutoff. You don't want it to fall down in and explode. And now the pipe will slip right down inside and rest right against the circuit board, against those little blobs of solder, where it should do no harm. Next we add our 3 batteries and the back end of the flashlight. Great, except something's still missing. Without a continuous piece of metal, the circuit can't complete and there's no continuity. There are many possible ways to bridge this gap. One way is to use a piece of electrical wiring. We could even flatten the piece of metal, because copper is malleable, by smashing it with a hammer on the vise, and make a shim that makes contact on both halves. Look at that. Great idea. And if we use redundant wires, it will make a nice tight fit, and it will be less likely to lose contact. What's the problem with doing this? This is some kind of aluminum alloy, and this is copper. And using dissimilar metals sometimes can promote corrosion. Okay, so copper's out. What about aluminum? Nope, I'm not kidding. You can take an aluminum nail and flatten it into a metal shim in exactly the same way I described with the copper. But that's an awful lot of work. Another possible source of the metal is a soda pop can, although this stuff is pretty thin. And if you do use it, you'll have to sand off the coating so that you can get down to raw metal and get a good electrical contact. Also, since it's so thin, it would take quite a number of wraps and probably be somewhat frustrating in order to shim this gap. I have a different idea. We'll try something else. Here we have some trim coil, and this stuff is popular in residential construction, usually in exteriors, and it comes in a big roll that you can unspool, and it's about 1/2 millimeter thick, which is about the same thickness as a common utility knife blade. If you look around, you should be able to scrounge up a piece of this, but in order for us to use it for electrical purposes, we need to get the finish off first. There's a trick to using one of these wire brushes on a drill that I wish somebody would have told me about 20 years ago. And I'm going to tell it to you right now. When it's just not cutting, put it in reverse. If you alternate between forward and reverse, it'll keep these little hairs from folding over and then becoming ineffectual. That works great right up until the end, but now I'm in danger of lifting this up, so I have to put it in reverse and finish it that way.
The big picture, the less it works in one direction, the more it will work in the other.
There we have it, raw metal. You don't have to do both sides. I wasn't paying attention and got carried away. Just do the side that makes contact with the flashlight. I want to cut this into 3 equal pieces, all of which about 1/4 of an inch or so smaller than our PVC. Almost there, but we have a square peg and a round hole. But 2 simple bends will help us approximate the curve. First, let's break it into 3 even parts. And this is about 5/8 of an inch wide, by the way. The nice thing about using 3 shims like this is that they can be adjusted for tightness. Simply pile up all 3 and then gradually flatten them in the vise until you get the perfect fit, the perfect profile. What I mean is that if they fit snugly to the PVC, it will fit with relatively little force to go inside the flashlight. But if we want it to be tighter and make a stronger contact against the metal, we can just bend them into more of a C shape. Now we put it together. Light goes down, and the shims will be held flush on the top, or rather flush with the end that's going towards the button. And the reason for that is because it will keep it just 1/4 inch shy down here, and that way it will just keep it safely away from the circuit board. We space the 3 out evenly, flush at the top, and press it down in. It should give a little bit of resistance. If it gives you too much resistance, put 2 shims in and the pipe first, and then drive the 3rd in last with a gentle tap. Kind of like, well, like you're driving in a shim. Next, batteries. And finally, the back end. For this part, we want our PVC to come to just to where the threads begin. It should go on as soon as both make contact. If it feels like you're screwing it in too tight, then this part of the assembly has to come up or back. Too loose, just right. We've established good contact, and so now all we have to do is fix the two halves permanently in place. And I know exactly what you're thinking. This project doesn't have enough epoxy. Before we start to smear epoxy all over everything, try to get everything that you'll need out and in the open, and give yourself some elbow room to work to limit the mess. And speaking of limiting mess, whenever you're working with epoxy, it's helpful to keep some isopropyl alcohol in a squirt bottle on hand with some napkins. That way, if you get it on your hands, it's easy to clean it up. Now that our assembly's been dry fit, let's begin by getting all of our pieces flush to the button end, and we'll tape them. This will just hold them in place while we work on the other end. Over time, it has become my opinion that the most economical way to use epoxy involves using a toothpick and masking tape. This will get it ready for us. And the piece of masking tape is disposable, and the toothpick is to mix it up. The mess is contained, and it's easy to control, and there's not much waste. The heat gun I may or may not use. What it does is thins the epoxy down. It makes it a little more watery, should I want it to do that. The penny is just for scale. We'll make a pile of both epoxy and hardener that are about that size. And why are there two toothpicks? For two reasons. Reason number one is that the first one tends to break sometimes. Reason number two is that if you don't need it, it prevents the masking tape from sticking down. Later I can peel this off and throw it away. If you whip it like this, you move the toothpick too quickly, the epoxy will take on a sort of milky look, and that's because you've introduced a lot of air bubbles into it. You can get some of them out by applying heat, but in most cases, it will be just fine either way. We'll work on one half at a time, trying to get some under this aluminum to attach it to the PVC, and enough will squeeze out onto the sides that the entire assembly should end up attached to the flashlight. Don't put any directly on the aluminum because we don't want to reduce the amount of metal to metal contact it makes. There's not tons of it on there, but a little is enough. Don't underestimate epoxy. This is the circuit board side. Just until it touches. That will be good. It's already starting to stiffen up, and not much will be wasted, but we can still use a little bit more of it by trying to fill in this little tiny gap right there. You have breathing time. Now we wait. And while we do, I would like to mention something to you. These videos are more about lateral application than the thing in general. I want you to pick up skills in these videos that you can transfer to other projects. It's really just a junky flashlight, so that's not really what the point is here. I know I've mentioned that before, but I want to drill that home. Okay, moving on. Cotton twine. Cheap, super absorbent. Why is that useful here? Super absorbent means that it's made of fibers, and those fibers are thirsty for liquid, which means that they'll absorb epoxy and become hard as a rock. So I have a 4-foot length of it already cut, and we're going to shove it down into that spot I was just showing you. And that brings me back to my point about lateral application. I want you to understand that epoxy can still be worked while it's not entirely cured. It's no longer liquid, but now it's kind of like taffy. And that taffy-like quality, Well, it has its own benefits because it's workable. In ceramics, there's this phase where pottery is not yet hard, where it's called leather hard. And in order to be a skilled craft person, you'll make use of that unique time during which a material might just so happen to take on some unique properties. Don't waste the opportunity to seize an advantage. When the epoxy's no longer drippy, it's not fully cured, it's easy to work. Even if you play with it while it's curing, it's still going to polymerize, and when it does, it will be tough. Epoxy session number 2, pretty much the same thing as what we've just done, except that this time we have to put the batteries in place. Try to practice this technique. Push the toothpick like this and then roll it. And what you'll do is consolidate your pile and clean your toothpick in the process. It's all in the way you twist your toothpick. That does it for session 2. And I did make a gauge so that I can make sure that this gap is correct. It's just over 3/4 of an inch. Now, patience. And let's take this battery pressure off, just so that the spring doesn't make this move as we wait. And yes, of course, it would have been easier to put the string on now with the second half. There are 3 spots where the PVC is still showing. They're sort of low spots, and we're going to fill those with epoxy, and then we're going to roll, and as we do it, we'll pull the string tight. Every once in a while, cinch it by pressing back on it like this. It will make the wrap nice and tight. And remember what I was saying about heat earlier? If you apply heat to the cotton at this point, it will liquefy the epoxy and make it want to run into the fibers. The reason I'm not doing that right now is because A, this room is pretty warm right now, and B, I'm in a hurry. Heat will make the epoxy set up faster. I don't know if you'll be able to tell on video, but I'm pulling it really tight. And when it no longer fits, right there, that's where I'll have to cut it off. Twist it nice and tight. Put a drop in behind it. And get it to snap down into that little spot I made for it. It's very tiny, very hard to film. If a little piece does stick up though, we can sand it off later. And at this point, we can apply a little more over top, or you can take your time, wait, and apply this with a 4th session. I think I'm going to give it a thin coat and then give it a little bit of heat. This is how I did it last time. And it really does work pretty well. Because it makes it nice and thin and uniform. It's all covered and it's becoming taffy hard. And here's a quick flashback of me making this 2 years ago. When you see this sort of shiny, opalescent, oily looking piece that still preserves the wood grain patterns inside of it, that's nearly pure carbon. And this is the type of char we're looking for.
We want char powder that's finer than frog hair. And so we can refine it by placing it on a piece of folded paper and then rubbing a hard object over it, just to smash up the little pieces. Just be sure to get the powder totally dry, because epoxy and moisture are not friends.
And again, we're patient. And now for our final session, we repeat the same thing again, covering all the char up and giving it a nice protective top coat. Much easier to do if you're not looking at it through a camera lens. But it doesn't matter. Either way, it will turn out just fine. There it is. It still needs to set up a little bit. How neat is it? Not as neat as the other one. But nobody really cares except you and I. And you can do your best to make it as neat as you want, but it's really a utility thing. And as I said before, it was mostly about using some different techniques. So I hope you got a kick out of this. Sorry it was a long one. Lots of stuff to discuss though. So, until the next subject, whatever that is, just try to pay special attention around the edges. We want it to be nice and watertight. Oh, and by the way, double A's and triple A's are both 1.5 volt batteries. That's why you can get away with it. Still here, huh? Okay, you want more. Cut a piece of bike inner tube into a 24-inch strip and make a Ranger band out of it. Now that our flashlight's a little bit heavier, we can make a shock absorber at its base that will not only protect it from impact, but it will help it to stand upright as well. And you still want more. Okay, you can make a miner's lamp for your head with a piece of copper wire and one of those things. And they still want more. Well, then you'll have to click on this video in which I use a golf ball, a piece of copper wire, some epoxy, and some PVC to make a